Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second of this museum's new collaborative program series, Charlotte Street Artists Virtual Walks. I'm Krishan McKinney, and I want to say hello to all of you, including our Facebook audience as we are streaming. So welcome. Once again, I'm Krishan McKinney. I'm the manager for audience engagement here at the museum, and I'm joined by my collaborative programming partner, Christine Boutros, who's the grants and awards program manager at Charlotte Street, along with our other Charlotte Street colleagues, Hope Benson, who's the marketing and outreach manager, and then our Nelson-Atkins colleague, Madison Zalaponi, who's the director of public and community access program. And so for tonight, we are very excited to have Taiwanese American artist, arts administrator, and 2020's Visual Artist Award fellow, Kathy Liao. Welcome, Kathy. It's so important that we give voice to our Kansas City artists and acknowledge their talents, cultures, and contributions that make this city great. So we're honored to feature Kathy this evening, especially as we celebrate Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. All right, Hope, would you please go ahead and share our welcome slide? Thank you. So everyone, you have different views that you can take advantage of. There's the speaker view, gallery view, and I also want to let you know we do have captioning available, so it has been enabled. Feel free to turn on the live captioning by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Hope, next slide, please. Christine will be managing our Q&A session, and just a reminder, when submitting your questions, please select the QA option, not the chat. We're looking forward to an engaging conversation with you and Kathy. And as this is a safe place for dialogue, please be mindful and respectful of all of our guests when commenting or submitting your questions. Hope, next slide, please. And now I'm going to turn it over to Christine.
Thanks, Krishan, and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. It's been wonderful working with the Nelson-Atkins on this event and program. So a little bit about Charlotte Street. The Charlotte Street Foundation envisions Kansas City as an exciting home and community for contemporary artists of all disciplines and career stages, and to energize the city by making it an amazing place for artists to live and work. Our programs include an artist residency program. We provide free studio spaces to artists, and we operate over 100 free events out of our new campus located at 333 Wyoming in Midtown Kansas City, as well as grants and awards to fund artists' work. Our longest running program, the Visual Artist Awards, was started back in 1997. And since that time, Charlotte Street has supported over 125 artists living in Kansas City through annual unrestricted cash awards distributed directly to artists. Currently, 5 awards of $10,000 each are awarded annually. 3 are to visual artists and 2 to performing artists. Over the years, we have granted over $1 million to local artists in the community through these awards. From 2011 to 2015, Charlotte Street Artist Awardees were invited to lead individual walking tours at the Nelson-Atkins, highlighting 3 to 4 pieces in the collection that may have inspired them or was meaningful to them in some way, and that was followed by a presentation of each artist's work. This 2021 reboot of the program is in a virtual format and features all 5 of the Charlotte Street Award winners who were granted funds in 2020. So this evening, we are so excited to introduce Kathy Liao. Kathy draws inspirations from her diverse cultural background and personal history. Her mixed media work is about the intimate yet universal concept of relationships. Kathy received her MFA in painting from Boston University and BFA in painting and drawing from the University of Washington in Seattle, and is a recipient of various awards, including the 2020 Charlotte Street Foundation Award, as well as the Elizabeth Greenshield Foundation Grant and artist grants and fellowships from Anderson Ranch Arts Center, Vermont Studio Center, and Gentle Artist Residency. Her work has been shown across the country and internationally. And in the past, Kathy was the director of the Painting and Printmaking Studio Art Program at the Missouri Western State University and is currently part of the Artist Services team at Mid-America Arts Alliance in Kansas City. So I just want to thank you all for joining us tonight. And now we're going to hear from Kathy. Thank you. Hi, Kathy.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, Christine. I'm a little nervous if you guys can't tell, and I hope you guys enjoy the video. I know Krishan is working on pulling that up, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you all. So please do post the question and answer or the questions in the Q&A, and I hope to have a conversation with you all after this. Thank you. Krishan, are you ready?
Okay, my name is Kathy Liao. I'm a visual artist here in Kansas City. A lot of my work has to do with kind of my personal story, my personal immigrant experience. I think a lot about kind of the repetition of a ritual of things that myself, my family, has done in the last 15 years since we moved to the United States. And so that comes through in my work in ways where I revisit instances where I think about my dad visiting every 3 months, and even just like the simple ritual of seeing him packing and unpacking luggages, right? That seems so trivial, but it is something that is repeated because the act of traveling back and forth. I think about phone calls. My dad used to place to reach me for 15 years. He always calls me from Taiwan every day. And so it's those little things that has stuck with me. And now in my work, I find ways to like translate that, to share that experience with people. I think that repetition in some ways also mirrors my process in the studio, right? Whether it's creating a print, whether it's drawing in line, in marker, and just repeating that gesture, that mark over and over again. So I think there is a lot of, to me, I find comfort in that there is that correspondence between my personal process within the studio and with that repetition that happens with my life. I observe that repetition. And I also, on kind of a bigger view, I also recognize that repetition happens in many families' lives, right? Like it's not just me traveling, it's not just me missing family, it's not just me, right? Like I feel like there is that repetition becomes that universal language that everyone experiences. And I think I'm trying to pull that thread out and see if we can find like this shared story or that shared experience. Prior to the pandemic, I was working on these larger pieces that's on the wall. And I was very interested, like I mentioned before, that sense of distance in between, or that space in between. I was making these work that talks about being at an airport, that sense of waiting, that sense of getting into a long, winding Custom and Border Security line. That's like a place that I remember very, very well and very fondly. Not fondly, it's not the right word, but I remember it well, right? Like that's something I'm super familiar with. And even the crowd in the airport, you know, like that sense of like weird space between two destinations. And so I was working on works that kind of that tries to recreate that space, that ambiguity of the space. And so I was working on these large paintings and large drawings. And of course, after the pandemic hit, I felt lost standing in front of some of those large pieces with sprawling space and people everywhere. Like, it just doesn't make sense anymore for me. So I felt like at that point, my studio practice kind of came to a halt because I was just trying to reassess, like, what is my work about? How is this relevant to what's happening around me right now? And even going back to the why, like, why am I making these work? And also recognizing that these work in the last, like, past 6 years, it's been building and I've been growing this body of work. And this pandemic almost gave me a pause to just step back and look at the work I'm making and think about what is important to me. In the last 9 months or so, I've transitioned my practice to working on smaller drawings. And I started working three-dimensionally because I almost feel like I just need to touch and mold and shape and get my hands, on something and actually create something. So I got into creating more three-dimensional forms, sculptures of some of the figures I'm familiar with, or even the gestures. I think a lot about gestures a lot in my work, where whether it's a person's like sitting, holding a phone, or reclining. So I think a lot about that gesture and how that gesture tells a story. And it becomes so much more real to me when I can start forming it, right? It's not just a three-dimensional image of a gesture, but it becomes like I have to look at it from the round, and I start to notice like the shoulder may slump a different way, or the head, even a slight head tilt is completely different in these three-dimensional forms I'm doing. So that's something I'm exploring. I was fortunate enough to be able to visit the Nelson and actually got to walk around and experience all the work again. And the piece that stood out to me immediately is Alison Sarr's Subway Preacher. I think maybe it's the combination of the different elements in that piece that really stood out to me. In the front, she has these two vases that are absolutely like, I keep coming to the word tactile because it does make me want to touch it. It has these symbolism on there with the flowers coming out. And further in the back, there's a sculpture of a figure and this beautifully painted backdrop. And I think that stood out to me because of the process I'm working in right now, where I am jumping back and forth from wall drawings, wall paintings, to sculptural elements, and thinking in terms of narrative and symbolism in my work too. So Alison's work really stood out to me. It is always awe-inspiring to stand in front of Ursula von Rydingsaard's work. And it definitely hits a chord right now because I am just starting to explore these sculptural forms that I'm making. And in many of my pieces, it's very intuitive. So I think as I'm coming up with these forms or images I want to create, my natural instinct is to find like materials that's readily available. And again, about 9 months ago, I started picking up these pink foam from Home Depot, and they're light and they're like easily, moldable or shapeable. So I brought those back and started stacking them layer by layer and layer to build it up. And then I started carving away from it. And so that experience of standing in front of Ursula's work, I felt that resonance in terms of the process of building up and carving away and building up and carving away. Being a painter by training, I feel like I do have to mention Fairfield Porter's The Mirror. I feel like every time I go to the Nelson, when I'm in the contemporary wing, I'm just mesmerized standing in front of it, seeing that little girl like staring back at you. The artist is back there standing in the room, but just seeing that girl staring back at you is so powerful. And in my work, I do work with portraits, and I work with self-portraits a lot too. And so I recognize that intensity of looking at a subject matter.
Thanks, Krishan.
Thank you. Beautiful work, Kathy.
Thank you, Krishan.
So, Kathy, as we're waiting for questions to come through, this is just a comment and something that really struck me, and it's really interesting to me, like at how you've been able to find common ground in a heterogeneous immigrant experience. And you talked about using repetition to find this universal language, this shared story, a shared experience. And, there's this waiting that happens, what's going to happen, life is on hold. And that really strikes me about your work, because as an immigrant, I also sense that, I also sense the distance, the disconnection, the waiting and the missing. And I do feel like I share your story, and your work really speaks to that experience for me. And it's very comfortable. And I'm really curious. I don't know how you do it. Like, how do you find that comfortable space for the viewer?
Thank you, Christine. By the way, that's not a statement, that's a question. Thank you for that observation. And it's interesting for me to hear that you mentioned that sense of comfort in seeing or in finding that relationship is, or that experience is relatable. For me, I think it's interesting in thinking about how I am bringing my personal story into these pieces. A lot of times when I do start them, I wasn't really actively thinking like, oh, I want to bring the story to you so you can relate to me, but it's very much kind of from a personal place where there is that moment that resonated with me a lot. And in this current pandemic, and I feel like I'm doing this work before the pandemic. I think about those long distance phone calls or those FaceTime interaction I have with my grandma. Like, that's something I have been doing for a long time. But this pandemic has kind of snapped everyone onto the same page. We all share this similar experience of, even here, we're using Zoom and using this virtual platform to connect. And many of us have this experience in this last year of, calling up a family member who could live just down the street or across the country because of our current social distancing, because of the current pandemic. So I feel like that experience becomes so much relatable, partly because of this pandemic, because everyone is experiencing it.
And that's really yeah. And I was also thinking, like, how you've gone from like these larger forms to something a lot more intimate, and like you're saying, you're honing it in and going, smaller, but also then 3-dimensional. And it kind of reminds me, like, of how the pandemic has felt. In some ways, it feels like your world has been getting smaller and smaller and shrinking, and in so many ways, with the lockdown and so forth. But then at the same time, like, there's this, like you said, your interactions are focused, and I feel like you've been doing that with your work. Like, do you feel that? Like, is that, I mean, do you explicitly or realize that that's happening, or
That's a great question. I think during the making of that video, I remember being asked about like just thinking about the repetition of whether it's handling objects or making marks. And I really like your observation about how the pandemic does change our experience, our relationship of, having this more open, expansive way of relating to another, to like something within quarantine, like just everything within our reach. And I think for me, that going to working in more sculptural form, or just like having that more tangible practice, was really grounding for me. Yeah, and maybe that is it. Like, I don't know if many people relate right now. When you do interact with your family from a really long distance, even if you're on FaceTime or on Zoom every single day, there is still that intangible, like, really, there's still that disconnect that still happens. And
Yeah.
so for me, like just being able to touch something,
Right.
it is very grounding at this moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that I did think about that whole like, and I think I mentioned to you earlier that whole feeling of like there are intangible things that happen in our lives,
Mhm.
but and there are also intangible aspects of culture and so forth. But I feel like you have
Yes.
made these things tangible and real and tactile. So we do have a few questions, Kathy, that have come
Mhm.
through. One is from Elizabeth, and they're saying, what a lovely video. But they have two questions. Where can we see more of your work? So that's number one. I'll let you answer that question first before I ask her second question.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You can find out more of my work at on my website at www.kathyliao.com, KATHYLIAO.com. So that's probably the first place you can directly, with a click, find out more about my work. I currently do have a few exhibits up. If you're tuning in from Wichita, I have an exhibit at Mark's Arts out in Wichita. And further out, if you're out in Michigan, I have another show in Flint, Michigan. And you can find out more of those information on the website too. Thank you for that question, Elizabeth.
And her second question is, the last image of the face reminded me of Hung Liu's work. What is your feeling about her practice?
I think, again, that's a really good question. That last portrait is actually a self-portrait. I'm taking a moment to think about this question because I felt like this is something that has been in the back of my mind. And I admire Hung Liu's work, and I've seen her exhibit her retrospective at the Kemper a couple years ago. I had the opportunity to speak with her and work with her as a visiting artist at the university a couple years back too. In recent years, and even more recently, thinking about my work as an Asian American artist, there is that tendency of kind of seeing Asian American artists as a monolith. I love Hung Liu's work, but I do think we're sharing our personal experiences kind of on a, like we're telling different story, even though it's an Asian American story, but it is very different. I feel like she does come from a different generation. Her immigrant experience is very different from mine versus I moved here when I was a kid, when I was young. So I feel like my experience, there's some overlap, but we're also sharing very different perspective of our stories. And yes, I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think about Hung's work a lot. And I also recognize that we are sharing very different stories. And I hope the viewers or all of you guys can walk in and look at our pieces and kind of see how we're experiencing the world in different ways too. So.
Thanks. Thanks, Elizabeth, for those two questions. Another question from Ling Yen Lu. How does coming to Kansas City change your artistic vision? Or has it changed your artistic vision?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that question. My practice has changed since I moved to Kansas City, and I'm going to answer this in two parts. The first part is just practice-wise. Prior to Kansas City, I was living in Seattle. I was in Boston for a while. My family's in LA, so I lived in these larger metropolitan cities. So majority of the time, my studio space is fairly small. So moving to Kansas City, I was pleasantly surprised with all the opportunities and support for artists here in Kansas City, especially in the context of like free studio spaces. So thank you, Charlotte Street. Like I really love having that space and time to be able to create. I'm currently in a studio residency too. So that allowed me to be more ambitious and explore works that I probably wouldn't have done before. And the second part of the question, Krishan, I see your hand. The second part of the question is in terms of the narrative of the work. It changed and pivoted towards these memories or these like personal anecdotes and interaction with my family, because where I am now here in Kansas City, more than ever, I do feel very, very far from them. I feel that disconnect. I feel my my experience here in Kansas City is very different from many places I lived, and especially back home in Taiwan. So a huge, like, there is that well of desire to be able to translate that slight disconnect, but at the same time, like Christine, you mentioned, there is that universal thread, that experience that can be recognized or acknowledged through my work.
Yeah. Okay, we have a few minutes remaining. I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. And I have here a question from Hope. And they're asking, well, they said, you mentioned choosing subject matter that speaks to an in-between place or emotional state that they find personally resonating. Having experienced uncertainty and isolation living in the Midwest as an Asian American. How does scale, abstraction, figuration serve as outlets for your work?
Thank you for that question, Hope. Yeah, I think in the video I did mention about some of those larger pieces. In some ways, one of the impetus of creating such a large scale of that airport scene, or that experience of going through custom and border security line, is in translating that immensity, like that the hugeness of the experience of having gone through immigration. I think my family spent the last 15 years coming to America, holding green card status until we were naturalized. And my dad, for the longest time, he passed away years ago, but I think it's always been his dream to be able to move to America, but that never came to fruition. So I think sometimes people don't recognize like how it looms large in our lives of that immigrant experience. So that's one aspect of the scale that I'm working with. The other part, in speaking to the intimate experiences, I find through my paintings and drawings, I love finding those little moments where, using composition, using colors, I can kind of start to see either like the divide of like depicting the distance from here to there, like using color and composition, or thinking about even something that may be feeling really close, right? I'm looking at our current screen right now, our faces next to each other, but we know that physically we're nowhere close. So I think that's something I think about a lot too, in terms of like collapsing that space, or just recognizing that even though your face might be next to each other, but there is still a divide, whether that's kind of more of an emotional divide or whether it's a physical divide. So I'm interested in those like tension, the space in between, and how that can tell a story, how a gesture can tell a story, whether it's like you're slumped forward or, the way you stand. I feel like all those language, all those vocabularies in painting or in drawing or in prints or sculpture, they all kind of tells a story.
Yeah. Well, I think that wraps it up for question time anyway. So I want to say thank you to all of you who asked Kathy questions. And Kathy, thank you so much for working with us and doing this work with us. And do you have any final comments or remarks before we hand it over to Krishan?
I just want to say thank you for this opportunity. I feel lucky to be able to walk by myself through the museum. I think a couple of months ago during the pandemic, just like being able to spend alone time in the museum and looking at those pieces. There's something beautiful about being able to do that. And thank you for this opportunity of letting me share my work. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And I hope we get to meet, in person in the near future. And thank you guys for tuning in. Krishan, I'll hand it to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you, Christine. And certainly thank you to all of our friends and colleagues behind the scenes that helped put this incredible presentation together. Definitely a very special thank you to Michelle Beckles, who is our Director of Graphic Design and Media Services. And certainly a great big thank you to you, our audience, and our Facebook audience. We hope you have enjoyed this evening and having that opportunity to just get a better sense of the incredible talents of Kathy and her vision and work. And we invite you to check out the remainder of the series. Hope has placed the link in the chat, and the chat also includes the link to Kathy's website. And next Artist Walks will feature the wonderful Corey Imick, who is the 2020 Visual Artist Award Fellow, and her presentation will be on June 2nd. So thank you all, everyone, and please have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone.